Dmitri Pavlovich, born in 1891, dying in 1942, was one of the few Romanov Grand Dukes to survive the Russian Revolution. His son and grandchildren will be able to see the restored Alexander Palace, a true rarity among the palace's 21st century residents. Ironically, Grand Duke Dmitri survived because of his involvement in the plot to murder Rasputin. Sent in disgrace by Tsar Nicholas II to join an army unit in Persia, now Iran, after the 1916 murder, Grand Duke Dmitri later escaped to England, and from there to the United States. He is the only Romanov whose line held elected political office in the United States. He was also the potential inspiration for the scrappy character Dmitri in the 1997 film Anastasia due to his playful relationship with Grand Duchess Anastasia. He left no memoirs, and his collection of diaries focus on surface-level events. The only information we have of him is personal recollections, family videos, and second-hand accounts of his activities. We see him in many of the photographs left behind by the imperial family, which is an incomplete collection due to the destruction by Bolshevik Zionist forces. With his sad gaze from green eyes and his blonde hair and tall figure, he is easily recognizable. He can be seen in film footage escorting his cousin, Anastasia, during the dynasty's tercentennial celebrations of 1913. He gave the impression of being a carefree, bon vivant Grand Duke for much of his life. But was he? His actions, at least at certain times, reveal a much more purposeful and complex human being than he wanted the world to see. Let's learn more about the exiled son of Russia, Grand Duke Dmitri. Dmitri Pavlovich Romanoff, Grand Duke of Russia, was born in 1891, the only son of Princess Alexandra of Greece and Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich. The beginning of his unstable childhood can be traced to the death of his mother in childbirth. He was afforded the material splendor of a Russian Grand Duke, but the emotional poverty of a motherless child. His birth took place under tragic circumstances. In the summer of 1891, Grand Duchess Alexandra and Grand Duke Paul visited Paul's brother, Grand Duke Sergei, at his country estate Ilinskoye near Moscow. You can learn more about this estate and Grand Duke Sergei on this channel. The Grand Duchess was 7 months pregnant with Dmitri when, while taking a stroll with some friends by the Moskva River, she jumped into a boat, falling as she got in. The guilt Sergei, who was very religious, must have felt must have been immense. The next day she collapsed in the middle of a ball from violent labor pains brought on by the previous day's activities. Dmitri was born premature in the hours following the accident. His mother slipped into a coma from which she never emerged. She died of eclampsia 6 days after Dmitri's birth in September 1891. Although doctors had no hope for the Grand Duke's survival, he lived, with the help of his uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, who gave the premature baby the baths that were prescribed by the doctors, wrapped him in cotton wool, and kept him in a cradle filled with hot water bottles to keep his temperature regulated, the treatment of the time to keep premature babies alive. At birth, Dmitri had an older sister, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, with whom he had a close relationship throughout his life, and who was one of the few Romanovs to give an authorized biography in the book The Last Grand Duchess. Grand Duke Paul was so distraught by the unexpected death of his young wife that he initially neglected his 2 small children. The children were therefore largely cared for by Paul's elder brother, Grand Duke Sergei, and his wife, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorova, who had no children of their own, likely due to Grand Duke Sergei's tuberculosis, and not homosexuality as the modern press is so eager to believe and push. The children of Grand Duke Sergei's favorite brother spent Christmases and later some summer holidays with Grand Duke Sergei and Grand Duchess Elizabeth, who set aside a playroom and bedrooms for the youngsters at their country home, Olinskoye. In his widowhood, Grand Duke Paul settled with his children in his palace in St. Petersburg for the remainder of the year. The children occupied a nursery suite on the second floor, looked over by nurses and attendants. A commander of the Imperial Horse Guards, Grand Duke Paul loved his children, but as was customary at the time, he refrained from showing them spontaneous affection. Grand Duke Dmitri and his sister were initially educated at home by governesses and private tutors, while they adored their father, who visited them twice daily at least. Like all male members of the Romanov family, Grand Duke Dmitri was destined to follow a military career, which traditionally began for a Grand Duke at the age of 7 and followed with an oath of loyalty to the Tsar at around age 18. This was delayed in Grand Duke Dmitri's case until he was 9 years old. In the spring of 1901, his education was entrusted to General George Mikhailovich Laming. Laming was a warm, affectionate man who became devoted to his young charge. He moved into the palace with his wife and their 4-year-old son Boris. In their apartments, Dmitri and his sister enjoyed a warm family environment. In 1895, when Grand Duke Dmitri was just 4 years old, his father began an affair with a married woman, Olga Valerianova Pistolkors. He was able to obtain a divorce for her as he was a widower, and he eventually married Olga in 1902 while the couple were staying abroad. The marriage was a violation of the house law of the Romanovs due to Pistolkors' lower noble and married status. They had married defying Tsar Nicholas II's opposition, and so the Tsar forbade them to return to Russia. Grand Duke Paul was not allowed to take the children with him into exile in Paris. Left fatherless, 11-year-old Dmitri and his 12-year-old sister were sent to live with their uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, and his wife, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the Empress's sister, in Moscow. The loss of their father and the sudden move to Moscow caused the children great distress. In her memoirs, Duchess Maria described Grand Duke Sergei as a stern disciplinarian and his wife as a cold and unwelcoming presence. In 1903, at the age of 12, her brother Dmitri was enrolled in the Chevalier Guard Regiment following studies at the Cavalry Academy. The highly disciplined, rigorous schedule of Grand Sergei's mansions was a noticeable difference from the carefree palace days of the children, and Grand Duchess Maria chafed against it most. In February 1905, Grand Duke Sergei, who had done so much for Moscow, was assassinated in his carriage by Zionist Bolsheviks. The assassination of Grand Duke Sergei is the subject matter of the French writer and philosopher Albert Camus' 1949 play, The Just Assassins. Camus is a wonderful writer, and his writing is definitely worth reading. Grand Duke Dmitri's uncle's death was only one of several assassinations that robbed Dmitri of close family members, and he turned ever more inwards, accompanying his cousin Tsar Nicholas II on long walks. After his foster father's death, Dmitri's father, Grand Duke Paul, was allowed to return to Russia to attend the funeral. He asked Tsar Nicholas II to restore the custody of his children to himself and his new wife, but instead the Tsar named Grand Duke Sergei's widow, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth, as the children's guardian. Grand Duchess Ella was also Nicholas' wife's sister. Dmitri's sister, Maria, continued to have some feelings of anger toward her aunt, whom she would blame for her overly hasty and unsuccessful marriage to Prince Wilhelm of Sweden in 1908. But Grand Duke Dmitri formed a very strong bond with his foster mother and came to admire her personal fortitude. They remained close throughout her life, and she came to bond with Dmitri's half-brother as well, through her father's taboo marriage. Grand Duke Paul had greatly distressed his family when he married Olga Karnovich, with whom he would have 3 children. A separate record states Grand Duke Paul returned to his home in Tsarskoye Selo during World War I at the command of the Tsar. His wife was eventually granted the courtesy title Princess Paley and would die in 1929. Grand Duke Dmitri's sister's wedding to Prince Wilhelm took place at Tsarskoye Selo in 1908, and she departed for Sweden with her husband that year. Grand Duchess Ella stayed on for a time at Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo as guests of the Emperor and Empress. It was during this time that Grand Duke Dmitri began to form a very close bond with Tsar Nicholas II, looking upon him as a surrogate father. He joined him on his daily walks and sought to spend as much time with him as possible. The emperor, in turn, treated his cousin very kindly. He seems to have loved the young man's free spirit and sense of humor, a welcome diversion from the stresses of his daily life. In 1909, Dmitri left his aunt's care to move to St. Petersburg with his head tutor and companion since childhood, General Laming. He lived at his father's vacant palace and then at the Bolosky-Bolozarsky Palace, which he had inherited from his uncle, Grand Duke Sergei. This neo-Baroque palace, located at the intersection of the Fontanka River and Nevsky Prospect, would become his principal residence until he left Russia. He prepared to enter the Nikolaevskoye Cavalry School. Upon graduation from there, he was commissioned as a cornet in the Horse Guards Regiment, which his father had once commanded, and in which he had been enrolled at birth. As a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II in the male line, he occupied a prominent position in the Russian imperial court and led a fast life in the Russian upper class. He was an excellent equestrian and competed in show jumping at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics on behalf of Russia. He placed 9th in the individual jumping event, and Russia placed 5th in the team jumping event. Disappointed in the performance of the Russian team, he started the idea of a national Russian sports competition, the very beginning of what under Soviet rule would become the Spartakiad, furthering the theme of the Soviets stealing ideas and foundations from the Romanovs and continuing them in a different manner. In spring 1914, Grand Duke Dmitri's father returned to live in Russia, settling with his second wife and new family at Tsarskoye Selo. Around the same time, Grand Duke Dmitri's sister, who had divorced her husband, also returned to Russia, moving in with Dmitri. However, troubled by her strong need for him after a period of independence, Grand Duke Dmitri distanced himself from his separated sister, hurting her terribly. Perhaps in this, he revealed his beliefs about marriage, that it should be for life. A few months later, World War I began. All members of the family joined the war effort. Grand Duke Dmitri served with the Life Guard Horse Regiment, participating in the campaign in East Prussia. During the first weeks of war, he was awarded the Order of St. George after he rescued a wounded corporal under heavy gunfire. In 1914, his friend Prince Felix Yusupov married the Tsar's only niece, Princess Irina. After this, according to Mariel Buchanan, he became more recklessly dissipated, helpless, and desolate. Historian Greg King claimed that Dmitri harbored an intensely romantic devotion to the openly bisexual Felix, which is questionable, continuing this bizarre thread in modern scholarship that all the Romanovs were gay. Prince Felix himself claimed it was because Dmitri had wanted to marry Irina that they had this change in mood. While their fathers were brothers, the Tsar was 23 years Grand Duke Dmitri's senior. Grand Duke Dmitri was a skilled horseman, providing a contrast to the Tsarevich Alexei, who was born in 1904 and sickly. Grand Duke Dmitri was a fixture of the imperial family until 1916, and accompanied his cousins and the Tsar on long walks, their yacht Standard, and holidays. After her husband's assassination in 1905, Grand Duchess Ella became a nun, founding a convent in Moscow. The embrace by his foster mother of the religious monastic life may have been perceived as rejection by Dmitri. She lived in relative obscurity and makes appearances on the historic canvas only a few times. In 1916, she appealed to her sister, the Tsarina, to send Grigory Rasputin away. They parted for the last time acrimoniously. You can learn more about the Tsarina, Empress Alex, on this channel. Empress Alex probably never learned what she threw away that day in the warnings of her elder sister against the Siberian mystic. In July 1918, one day after the murder of the Romanov imperial family, the nun was thrown, along with other Romanovs, including Grand Duke Dmitri's half-brother, alive down a mine shaft in Alapayevsk in Siberia. Her body was discovered by the whites in the Civil War and transported to Jerusalem to a church she had often visited with her husband, Grand Duke Sergei, which he had built in his mother's honor. She had first been transported to China, but now has been buried in Jerusalem. She has also been canonized. The chief difficulty of any child who has known this type of upheaval is in the forming of close attachments with others, as well as empathy. It would be easy to be blinded by the material privilege enjoyed by Grand Duke Dmitri. But no amount of wealth can make up for a childhood where the person has every important figure in his life disappear, and frequently through violent, confusing external means. To survive, Grand Duke Dmitri had to become almost numb regarding death, and such a personality seemed doomed for martyrdom. But that was another tragedy about Grand Duke Dmitri. He was never martyred. This phenomena led to his difficulties as a young man. Emperor Nicholas and his wife were very fond of young Dmitri. Evidence exists that they wanted him to marry their eldest daughter, Grand Duchess Olga, and pass on the throne to them jointly around 1905, in the likely event Tsarevich Alexei did not survive childhood due to his hemophilia. The willingness of the emperor to tamper with the order of succession is well documented. His 1917 abdication on behalf of his son was illegal under existing law, and it remains unknown why he didn't evoke the powers that would have enabled his capable, patriotic daughters to be directly in line for the Russian throne without being married. The impediment to implementing the alternate succession plan was not Grand Duke Dmitri, but Grand Duchess Olga. She was serious, having been responsible for her 4 siblings at a young age, and very religious. By 1911, the 20-year-old Dmitri had grown up, but not matured. For all intents and purposes, it appeared in 1911 that Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich was being groomed to become the future husband of the emperor's eldest daughter, his own first cousin twice removed, Grand Duchess Olga. She made plain that she would never leave Russia to marry, just like her grandmother, and this decision fueled the rumors. Undoubtedly, the signals were enough for the foreign press to pick up this gossip in St. Petersburg and spread it around. But in fact, the possibility of a compromise was already being anticipated much more closely within the imperial household itself, as confirmed by General Sporadovich. Everyone appreciated Dmitri's presence, for he lightened the somewhat dull atmosphere at court. The Grand Duke often appeared unceremoniously after merely announcing his arrival over the telephone to the Emperor. The Emperor's affection for him was so great that the entire retinue already saw in him the future fiancé of one of the Grand Duchesses. Whether or not the rumors were true, a possible marriage between Dmitri and Olga soon became problematic. In the autumn of 1912, he had come increasingly under the influence of a childhood friend, Prince Felix Yusupov, and was quickly drawn into that racy lifestyle of immoral St. Petersburg that Yusupov attended. The 2 men spent their time in the city recklessly, drinking, eating, dating ballerinas and gypsies, and driving fast cars. Like any distinguished young men in the days just before World War I, with money to spare and very little to occupy his time, Dmitri developed a dangerous gambling habit. He owned his own palace on Anechkov Bridge and began to frequent the Imperial Yacht Club next to his favorite restaurant in the Astoria Hotel. When he wasn't risking his luck in a game of poker in Baccarat, he was doing it in Paris. Sooner or later, Dmitri's playboy lifestyle must have reached Nicholas and Alexandra, and Olga as well. It was already ruining his good looks, but Dmitri would be a lifelong smoker. Olga might have been young, but she had determination, deep religiosity, and principles. This changing of behavior supposedly ruined his chances of becoming the emperor's first son-in-law. While Grand Duchess Olga, who was 4 years Dmitri's junior, and her sisters are frequently characterized as immature, they were thoughtful, deeply devout young women. Grand Duke Dmitri's love of high living, however forced and influenced by others, and comparatively loose ways, very likely shocked the more straight-laced and hidden Grand Duchess Olga. They were also first cousins once removed, a connection she may have felt was not healthy for any children they would have together, so close was she to her hemophiliac brother. As the daughter of two deeply in love individuals, she may have also wished the same for her marriage. Regardless of her reasoning, we do know Grand Duchess Olga was steadfast in her refusal to enter into a dynastic marriage, and her feelings may have changed after Grand Duke Dmitri's friendship with Prince Yusupov, whom her mother did not approve of. Grand Duchess Olga also refused the suits of her cousin Boris Vladimirovich and Prince Carol of Romania. Her diaries were full of affection towards lower noble Russian men, who would later fight and die in the White Army. Here are some entries from 1913. These are about Alexander Konstantinovich Shvedov, whom she abbreviated as AKSHV of 1913. I sat with him the whole time and fell deeply in love with him, she wrote. May the Lord keep us. Saw him all day long at Obdenya and at breakfast, also in the afternoon and the evening. It was so nice and fun. He is so sweet. We rode by the church, the barracks, and the assembly. I hoped to see my dear, and got lucky. He and a bunch of other officers were on the balcony. Dear AKSHV smiled from across the crowd. Dear AKSHV was there. I stared at his back from far away the entire time, from April 1913. Towards the end, with great joy, I unexpectedly saw him. I was happily anticipating to see him on this day, but he was not there, of course, so awfully tiresome. Grand Duchess Olga's refusal of Dmitri around 1912, if it existed, did not estrange Dmitri from his imperial cousins. He continued to flirt with the other Grand Duchesses and enjoyed a high degree of intimacy with the family. Empress Alex in her diaries despaired of his involvement with the fast social set. The richest young man in Russia, Prince Felix Yusupov, among them. All of these indicate a great closeness, at least on the part of the imperial couple. With his likely difficulties in forming close attachments, it seems unlikely Grand Duke Dmitri would sacrifice family stability for anything more than a huge passion. We know in 1916 he was thought of well enough to accompany the imperial family to Mogilev, and we see him in pictures with Grand Duchess Tatiana at that time. There are many unanswered questions regarding his involvement in the plot to kill Rasputin. We do know he swore to his father on a cross that he did not kill the man, but Grand Duke Sergei had been Dmitri's foster father and was killed by the same forces that Rasputin mixed among. In Prince Yusupov's recollection of the murder, published in his autobiography, he is careful to attach all the blame for the murder on himself. It is unlikely that Grand Duke Dmitri was ignorant of the Tsarevich's medical condition. So what did he, like his foster mother Grand Duchess Ella, see in this Siberian mystic, this hypnotist, this so-called healer that was so terrible? Empress Alex was adamant that Rasputin could calm the young prince like no doctor. If Grand Duke Dmitri was the carefree person he supposedly was, why did he involve himself in a murder plot? He was a military man, he loved the imperial family, and did not flee Russia despite the murderous forces present. He could have lived in Paris like his father did, but he didn't, and so one must assume that on some level he loved his country. The conspirators in the 1916 murder of the degenerate so-called priest were shielded from the law, as Grand Dukes were answerable only to the Tsar for their actions. Grand Duke Dmitri then reveals himself as more purposeful than his image. But what was his purpose? History shows Rasputin ventured out of the narrow confines that would have made his association with the imperial couple acceptable. He was ambitious, power-hungry, sought and obtained political influence, at least with Empress Alex, with disastrous consequences. When we look at the conspirators behind the 1916 murder of Rasputin, we see Grand Duke Sergei's imperial guard among them. Who would have spoken to this former regiment if not Grand Duke Dmitri? There are multiple theories which could explain Grand Duke Dmitri's motives. The one loudest by Prince Yusupov is that Rasputin was murdered out of Russian patriotism. The young men thought that, with Rasputin dead, the Tsar could reclaim his slipping prestige and the prestige of the family. Tsar Nicholas II was away commanding his army in December 1916, and his wife and children were being smeared almost daily in the tabloids with lurid, if untrue, stories involving Rasputin. If Grand Duke Dmitri even believed half of what he read, it would be enough. Grand Duke Dmitri perhaps didn't like to see Rasputin's influence over Empress Alex, and we know he looked at her tenderly in photographs together. As a cavalryman, he probably thought Russia should be run differently in wartime. Grand Duke Dmitri knew the Tsar well enough to know that he would not listen to the family's advice. He remained close to his foster mother Ella, an outspoken Rasputin critic. His cousin's reputation suffering, and with the only mother he had ever known urging Rasputin's removal and then being rebuffed by her sister the Empress, would that have been sufficient motive for Dmitri? The other theory, never published but divulged by Maria Pavlovna after her brother's death, was that Rasputin was preparing to go to the Empress with damaging information about the flamboyant Prince Yusupov. The patriotic motive, she told friends, was a cover for the true reason, and devised after the murder. But did Prince Yusupov, whose family had owned some of the best palaces, the best jewels in Russia for generations, really care what Rasputin or Empress Alex thought? It seems unlikely. This theory also presumes a very high degree of loyalty on Grand Duke Dmitri's part to Prince Felix Yusupov and his reputation. But the two didn't remain friends in exile. It's been proffered that any affection Dmitri had for Yusupov was due to Yusupov marrying the love of Dmitri's life, Princess Irina. And was Grand Duke Dmitri's affection for Grand Duchess Olga and her sisters so shallow? Was the cunning Rasputin foolish enough to sit on information, extremely damaging information, to the immensely wealthy Prince Yusupov and do nothing to protect himself if this theory is true? He had networks of spies and journalists. It's entirely at odds with the documented evidence we have that Rasputin destroyed careers with a mere whisper to his Tsarina, and immediately. Third, a member of the Duma was one of the conspirators as a part of a pro-monarchy faction in the Duma at the time. Purishkevich had no known connection to the two others except for his desire to remove Rasputin, and so the nationalist bent to the plot seems strongest. The precise political motive may never be known. One may accept what Yusupov wrote as true. But there is another very interesting theory. Grand Duke Dmitri was mentioned as a successor to the Tsar during the Revolution of 1905. With Grand Duke Sergei dead in a blatant, violent assassination, Tsar Nicholas II would have looked at his relations with a much more critical eye. He could rely on Grand Duke Sergei to implement authoritarian policy like he could with no one else. What if he should be assassinated as well? In 1905, Grand Duke Dmitri was old enough and healthy enough to handle the imperial throne unlike the Tsarevich. There were numerous plots in 1916 and 1917 to remove the Tsar by members of the Romanov family, in addition to the plots by the insatiable, murderous Bolsheviks. Most frequently mentioned in the later plotting was Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, former commander-in-chief, but he refused to join in a palace revolution. It is certainly possible that Rasputin's murder was the opening act of a plot to remove Tsar Nicholas and replace him with Dmitri, but putting Dmitri in the line of power was Tsar Nicholas's idea in the first place. It seems like a very roundabout way of changing the imperial order. Regardless, at 4:50 a.m. on December 17, 1916, Grand Duke Dmitri drove the assassins Felix Yusupov, Vladimir Purishkevich, Dr. Stanislaus de Lazavert, and Lieutenant Sergei Mikhailovich Sugatin, and Rasputin's body, wrapped in a broadcloth, to Petrovsky Bridge, which crossed to Krestovsky Island. Around 5 a.m., they threw the body into the Malaya Neva, into a hole they made in the ice. All along, Grand Duke Dmitri, who had excellent driving skills, never saw Rasputin's body. News of Rasputin's murder spread quickly. An evening newspaper already published details of the assassination, correctly identifying the place and some of the details just a few days after. By Sunday, Dmitri was placed under house arrest. Prince Yusupov, who had tried to flee to Crimea, was stopped at the train station. He was living at his mother-in-law's palace, but on the advice of his uncle by marriage, he moved to Dmitri's palace for protection, as it was the prerogative of the Tsar alone to prosecute the Grand Dukes. Rasputin's body was found on December 19th by a river policeman who was walking on the ice and discovered it. The post-mortem was held the following day. Major General Popple carried out the investigation of the murder. By this time, Dr. de Lazavert and Lieutenant Sukatin had fled from the city. The investigator interviewed Grand Duke Dmitri, Felix Yusupov, and Vladimir Purishkevich, but decided not to charge them with murder. In recognizing that a beloved member of their household killed and attacked Rasputin, who Empress Alex felt had saved the Tsarevich's life repeatedly, the Tsar and Tsarina undoubtedly felt betrayed. Grand Duchess Olga herself named Prince Felix as the murderer in her diary. When a petition circulated around the palaces, signed by members of the royal family that Grand Duke Dmitri should remain in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II thought about it for 5 days before writing in response what anyone expected him to do about it. In punishing Dmitri after December 1916, as has been established, the imperial family saved his life. They most certainly knew of this irony before they themselves were murdered by Zionists. In the early hours of January 6, 1917, Grand Duke Dmitri left St. Petersburg, never to return. After 4 days of travel, he reached Baku, Azerbaijan, on the Caspian Sea, sailing the next morning to the southern Persian shore. At his arrival in Persia, he was welcomed by his officers, as his reputation for the Rasputin assassination made him popular. He served 10 weeks under General Nikolai Baratov, who headed the 1st Cossack Corps on the Caucasus front in the Persian city of Gazvin. Within 2 months, the Tsar was forced to abdicate, ending the rule of the Romanovs. General Baratov asked Dmitri to leave since there were rumblings from the lower ranks and his safety could not be guaranteed. Ronald Wingate entertained the Grand Duke when he passed through the city of Najaf. The provisional government invited him to return to Russia, but he declined. Lacking both friends and money, he lived precariously. In the summer of 1917, he left the Russian occupation zone, moving to Tehran. He stayed briefly with General Meidel of the Russian army, then the head of the Persian Cossack division, before being taken in by the British minister to Tehran, Sir Charles Marling, and his wife Lucia. Through 1917 and most of 1918, Grand Duke Dmitri lived with the Marlings. Sir Charles Marling obtained an honorary commission for Dmitri as a liaison officer with the British mission, and eventually persuaded the British Foreign Office in 1918 that he would become the next Emperor of Russia, gaining his admission to England after many previous rejections. Marling became an important father figure to Grand Duke Dmitri, and the relationship there established between the Grand Duke and the entire Marling family would prove to be close and enduring. Marling and his family took Dmitri with them when they left Tehran for England at the end of 1918. During the long journey to England in a slow steamer ship, he fell ill with typhoid fever in Bombay and nearly died. Grand Duke Dmitri had to recuperate in Cairo. In January 1919, he arrived in France via Egypt. He crossed the Mediterranean, disembarked in Marseille, continuing by land to Paris. He kept an apartment at the Hotel Georges V, and in France he learned of the tragic end of many of his family. The Marlings took him to London, where he was reunited with his maternal aunt, Grand Duchess Maria. She provided him with the money from the proceeds of the sale of his St. Petersburg palace, which had gone through before the Bolsheviks seized power, indicating the knowledge that some of the Romanovs had of the chaos that was to come. Grand Duke Dmitri took a room at the Ritz and spent most of his time with his aunt. He went to Sussex and visited Natalia Brasova, the Empress, for a day, his youthful crush. She was devastated by the loss of her husband, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, and Grand Duke Dmitri quickly returned to his own life, instead of spending more time with her, again repeating the pattern of withdrawing from married, unhappy women. Lady Marling went to see the King's assistant private secretary, Lord Cromer, to inform him of the Grand Duke's arrival. But the King was horrified at the development due to the powerful presence of Bolsheviks in England, which continues, and Grand Duke Dmitri was quickly visited by a Foreign Office representative who asked him to leave England, suggesting he go to Malta. Grand Duke Dmitri refused unless the order came directly from George V himself, and the matter was dropped. His presence was an inconvenience to the British government that did not want to upset the new Bolshevik regime, and the Tsar's regime had been seen in Britain as brutal and bloody due to a consistently biased press. In London, Grand Duke Dmitri was finally reunited with his sister, Grand Duchess Maria, who had escaped revolutionary Russia through Ukraine with her second husband, Prince Putyatyn. Dmitri moved with his sister and brother-in-law, taking a house together in South Kensington. The Yusupovs had escaped Russia with a dowager Tsaritsa, and they too settled in London. Felix tried to renew their former friendship, but Grand Duke Dmitri avoided him, resenting Yusupov breaking off the oath of silence regarding the event of Rasputin's assassination and potentially blaming him for his exile. Relations between Dmitri and his brother-in-law also soon soured. In spring 1920, Grand Duchess Maria returned to Paris to meet with their stepmother, Princess Paley, and their two half-sisters. She decided to stay in the French capital in order to be close to them. Unhappy in England, Dmitri followed his sister to Paris in the summer of 1920 and became part of the scene of Russian expats. In Paris, he took rooms at a hotel until he found a modest two-room apartment. The proceeds from the sale of his St. Petersburg palace enabled him to live well, but they depleted quickly. He had given generously to other Russian émigrés and to Russian charities. In the summer of 1921, Dmitri accompanied his sister to Denmark to a reunion with her son, Prince Leonard. While in Denmark, he saw the Marling family again, and with his sister visited the Dowager Empress, who had retired to her villa Hivador. You can learn more about her jewelry collection on this channel. With his money depleting, the Grand Duke Dmitri found employment serving on the board of a champagne firm. An American journalist described him around this time as attractive. He is, in his slender, well-groomed person, all that a Grand Duke should be, especially if you like your Grand Duke young, clean-shaven, and concave at the waistline. He has a figure like Rudolph Valentino. Well known in the Paris scene of the 1920s, Dmitri was then having an affair with opera singer Marta Develli. It's possible that he was the inspiration for some of F. Scott Fitzgerald's short stories, which star Russian dukes. It was through the singer Marta Develli that Grand Duke Dmitri became close to Gabrielle Coco Chanel. "You take him," the singer allegedly offered him to her old friend. "He is too expensive for me." You can learn more about Chanel's friendship with Salvador Dali on this channel. Chanel and Dmitri, who had actually met before in pre-World War I Paris, became lovers. Their relationship lasted around a year. It began in spring 1921 with an off-season stay in Monte Carlo, where they tried to live as discreetly as possible. Dmitri's sister found a niche for herself in the rising Paris fashion industry by founding a business called Kitmere that specialized in bead and sequin embroidery and did that work for Chanel. It was Dmitri who introduced Chanel to Ernest Beau, the perfumer who created Chanel No. 5, her most enduring product. Coco and Dmitri spent a happy summer at a villa near Arcachon. Their romance fizzled out, but they remained friends. Chanel would later comment, "These Grand Dukes, they are all the same, an admirable face behind which there is nothing, green eyes, broad shoulders, fine hands, the most peaceful people, shyness itself. They drink just not to be afraid. Tall, handsome, superb, these Russians are, and behind that is nothing, hollowness and vodka." As the youngest Grand Duke to have survived the Russian Revolution, Dmitri was a prominent figure of the Russian community in exile. He had been proposed as a potential candidate for the throne by several monarchist groups, potentially remembering the earlier claim. During the early 1920s, there was a bitter rivalry between the camps of the supporters of Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich and those of Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, while those who supported neither Nicholas nor Kirill advocated for Dmitri's candidacy for the Russian throne. In August 1922, a makeshift Zemsky Sobor was convened and Grand Duke Nicholas was elected emperor. The Grand Duke neither accepted nor refused this empty gesture. Having waited for confirmation of the death of Tsar Nicholas II, his son, and his brother, in 1924 Grand Duke Kirill announced that he would assume guardianship of the throne of Russia. Shortly thereafter, he issued his manifesto on the assumption of all imperial rights and the title of emperor. In September 1924, Grand Duke Alexander Nikolaevich issued an appeal to Russians to stand with this self-proclaimed emperor. It was at this time that Grand Duke Dmitri, who had no political ambitions for himself, supported instead the claim of his first cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich. But Grand Duke Dmitri was active politically in causes for the Russian people with monarchist ties. Together with his cousin, Prince Dmitri Alexandrovich, he was very involved in the monarchist youth organizations which sprang up in the years between the wars. By 1923, the largest of these was the Union of Young Russia, which preached orthodoxy, nationalism, monarchism, and peasant collectivism. In 1923, Grand Duke Dmitri's sister divorced her second husband and bought a small house at Boulogne-sur-Seine, and Dmitri moved with her to the top floor. As he worked at Reims for the Champagne Company, he was out most of the day, but spent the evening with his sister. Invited to a tea party at Versailles with his sister, he met Audrey Emery, a sophisticated and attractive American heiress from Cincinnati. Her father was a self-made millionaire, and after his death her mother had married a son of the second Earl of Lichfield, bringing her into the role of nobles. Grand Duke Dmitri had no fortune to offer her, but they fell in love, and they were married in the Orthodox Church at Biarritz in November 1926. It was a morganatic marriage, and Audrey, who converted to Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Anna Ionova in baptism, was granted the title Her Serene Highness by Grand Dmitri's cousin, Grand Duke Kirill. They spent their honeymoon in England, where they established their first home. The couple's only child, Paul Romanovsky-Ilinsky, was born in London in 1928. Paul grew up in France, Britain, and the United States. He served as a United States Marine in the Korean War. In 1989, he was elected mayor of Palm Beach, Florida, and thus became the only Romanoff descendant so far known to have held elected public office. Following the fall of Communist Russia in 1991, a delegation of Russian royalists approached him and asked him to assume the title of the Tsar, which he declined, and he lived until 2004. In 1928, the Dowager Empress of Russia died, and Grand Duke Kirill was received at the funeral as head of the House of Romanov by the royal family of Denmark. This was the last time that the entire dynasty appeared as a single undivided family, and Grand Duke Dmitri was a prominent figure in the proceedings. The youngest of the Grand Dukes, Dmitri Pavlovich, frequently represented Grand Duke Kirill at events, public, private, and political. He was prominent at the funerals of Constantine I of Greece in 1923, Queen Astrid of the Belgians in 1935, and at the wedding of Grand Duchess Kira to Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia in 1938. Grand Duke Dmitri was a noted collector of model trains and was at some point considered to have held one of the largest collections in Europe. During the Nazi annexation of Paris, Dmitri's collection vanished, and it has since been theorized that these were seized by Hermann Göring, a model train collector himself. In the late 1920s, Grand Duke Dmitri became involved with his cousin, Prince Dmitri Alexandrovich Romanoff, in the monarchist youth organizations. By 1923, the largest of these was the Union of Young Russians, which was renamed in 1925. This was a Russian nationalist group influenced by the Italian fascists, formed with the express purpose of establishing a Soviet monarchy in Russia. Grand Duke Dmitri joined this group as a stand-in for his cousin, who, as pretender to the throne, could not affiliate himself directly with any political organization. In 1935, Grand Duke Dmitri gave a series of speeches to Young Russia chapters throughout France. Over the next few years, however, he grew disillusioned with the group and ultimately broke with it entirely. He spoke out publicly against Hitler in January 1939 and did not take kindly to Germans looting Russian palaces during World War II. Grand Duke Dmitri reputedly rebuked later advances from Hitler to lead exiled Russian nobles within the German army against the Bolsheviks, with the firm statement that nothing would induce him to fight against fellow Russians, Bolsheviks or not. Grand Duke Dmitri and his wife could afford a very opulent lifestyle with her income, with homes in London, Biarritz, Neuilly-sur-Seine, and Château de Beaumessil near Cannes, and visits to America. But after 10 years of marriage, they were divorced in 1937. He lived at the chateau, which he had bought himself in 1927. Over the years, he became disappointed with the prospects for the restoration of the monarchy in Russia and withdrew from public life. He lived at the chateau until 1938, when, due to the deterioration of his health, he sold it, and I believe the chateau remains a private home. In 1937, his ex-wife remarried. His son Paul was at school in England, but Dmitri could spend the school holidays with him until 1939, when it was decided to send Paul to America for safety. They saw each other for the last time in Genoa, spending 3 days together before Paul embarked to America. Despite not having strong health, Grand Duke Dmitri was, for most of his life, a very active sportsman, excelling at polo, horse riding, tennis, and bobsledding. His doctors in London and Davos estimated he first contracted tuberculosis around 1929, potentially in Paris, which ran a chronic course. He entered the sanatorium Schatzalp in Davos, Switzerland, in September 1939, the day after the German invasion of Poland, and remarked in a letter to his sister that he had never before spent a single night in any kind of hospital. His health began a steady decline in August 1940. In the autumn of that year, he underwent an unsuccessful operation and was confined to bed for 3 months afterwards. He was deeply affected by the political events going on around him. After 2 more operations in January and February 1941, the doctors were optimistic. From the safety of the sanatorium in Davos, he followed with great interest the events, and he wrote to a friend in April 1940 on the eve of the collapse of France, "Every single event looks petty in comparison with world events." In March 1942, Grand Duke Dmitri organized a Russian festival to entertain himself with his friend and the staff. The celebration continued until late into the night. The following morning, he suffered a sudden attack of kidney failure and died at the age of 50. He was laid to rest in the Waldfriedhof of Davos, Switzerland. After the death of his sister in December 1958, his nephew, Prince Leonard, had him buried along his sister in the chapel of his castle on the island of Manau in Lake Constance, where they now lie in the Bernadotte family crypt. During the Russian Revolution, Dmitri lost his father, Grand Duke Paul, who was assassinated by the Bolsheviks at the fortress of Peter and Paul in January 1919 and thrown into a mass grave. His half-brother, Prince Vladimir Paley, was murdered along with his foster mother, Ella, the day after the murder of the imperial family on July 18, 1918. Since he left no memoirs, it is impossible to know precisely how all this carnage affected Grand Duke Dmitri. His diaries, deposited in an American university library, reveal he wrote little about Russia. This fact is often cited as evidence that he cared little for what was happening in his motherland. Instead, it may be evidence of a survivor's mentality and of a young man who could, to some degree, let go of his past. Perhaps he was also worried about the diaries falling into the wrong hands. Grand Duke Dmitri killed a parasite on the heart of Russia, Grigory Rasputin, and the response from the family he loved was to exile him thousands of miles away. Perhaps you, too, would want to forget. Grand Duke Dmitri recognized the claim of Grand Duke Kirill to the non-existent Russian throne during the 1920s. In 1926, he married an American heiress but procured the Imperial Majesty title for his wife from Princess Alinsky. This could be further evidence of political aspirations on his part. He was certainly politically active. By then, the murder of the imperial family was known. The Bolshevik regime under Stalin was not at all secure in spite of their victory over the Whites in the Civil War. Perhaps Grand Duke Dmitri felt he had to act to protect the interests of any children he would have, and he had to choose a side. He divorced when his son was 9 years old. The prince lived to manhood, fathering 4 children, and was mayor of Palm Beach, Florida. He was also naturalized under the name Paul Alinsky and never pretended to the throne. However, Prince Paul Dmitrovich Romanoff, great-grandson of the Tsar Liberator, is now recognized by numerous monarchy organizations as the heir to the Russian throne. Grand Duke Dmitri died at the age of 50, the same age as that of his cousin, Nicholas II, who had both exiled him and saved his life.